So, Elden Ring is finally here, and it is massive. Even after almost 20 hours with it, felling 3 main bosses and a whopping 20 optional ones, and exploring and filling in what seems like at least 2/3 of the world map, I'm still seemingly in the early sections of the game. The scale and scope are staggering, and I'm utterly impressed with the world From Software has crafted with the lands between. That said, I've played enough to have some really strong opinions about this game already, and I desperately need to talk about them. But before I get into those thoughts, let me just say that this discussion will be entirely spoiler-free. I will be talking about the game's overall design and pacing, now that I've played enough to see how Elden Ring is structured, but I'm not going to mention any specific gameplay moments, no specific bosses or specific content. I'm just using trailer footage for this video too, to avoid spoilers, which after a long weekend with the game, I can confidently say the trailers show practically nothing of what's actually in Elden Ring, so you can watch or listen to this video without fear of spoilers. Also, I just want to say from here on out, this is going to be an unscripted discussion, kind of like what I did after beating Final Fantasy VII Remake. I have an outline and some major points that I want to go over, but really, I just wanted to sit down, digest my thoughts on Elden Ring this far, and get them out there. So let me preface this discussion by saying this. From Software games are among my favorite all-time games. Demon Souls and Dark Souls in particular, they got me reinterested in console video games in a way that I just wasn't during the 360 and PS3 generation. And then Dark Souls came out and it pretty much changed everything. It's because of Dark Souls that I pursued a career in games media. And now I get paid to write about video games for places like GameSpot and Pop Science and Digital Trends and tons of other places. You know, I even love Kingsfield and Shadow Tower, and really just all of From Software's games are what led me to seek out more challenging old school style games like Wizardry and Etrian Odyssey and other dungeon crawler RPGs, which are the exact types of games that I am now actively making. So trust me when I say that I hold From Software in super high regard. Their games are incredibly important to me. And so I was really excited for Elden Ring. I haven't been this excited for a game since Breath of the Wild, and probably before that it was maybe Metal Gear Solid 4 or Skyrim. The hype levels after you get a little bit older start to get a little bit lower. So the fact that I'm this excited for Elden Ring, I mean, it feels like, you know, being a kid and being excited for, I don't know, the next Zelda, you know, Wind Waker, Majora's Mask or something. That's what it feels like to me. So I was utterly stoked for this game. And so far, Elden Ring has largely lived up to my expectations and to the hype from those pre-release reviews, at least for me. And at times, I will say that I feel like Elden Ring is, you know, it's one of the most interesting, engrossing, and just best video games I've ever played. But at other times, I find myself in tension with some of From Software's decisions. Most of my thoughts all come down to the level design, which is often the case with me, and how From's unique design ethos impacts the open world, or I guess more accurately, how it doesn't. So I would say that the game is split into 3 major types of level content categories. You have the open world, which is just this, it's massive, it's gorgeous. The landscapes in this game, when people say you can't even imagine it, it's true, you can't even imagine it. And it's also varied and interesting. From Software's visual and level design has never been better, and they were already some of the best in the business, and it's even better with Elden Ring. It looks like a moving painting or a moving concept art at times, and I can't even believe they made this game sometimes. But in terms of the actual mechanics of that open world, it's very sensorially engrossing, but the map itself, which you know, there is a map in this game. You don't, other than Sekiro, there's never really been, in the Souls games at least, there's never really been a map like this before. And, you know, I'm going to be comparing it a lot to Breath of the Wild in this, but it's a lot like Breath of the Wild in that it encourages player-driven exploration, which is really exciting. It's exactly how I prefer exploration and discovery to be implemented in a video game. And of course, out in the open world, there's tons and tons of stuff to do. And 99.9% of that stuff is fighting enemies, which all range in difficulty. The stuff in the open world, at least the main enemies, as long as you're within the level range, it's not very difficult at all. In fact, it's pretty easy to fight these enemies. It's manageable in ways that sometimes Dark Souls or Bloodborne and other enemies, like low-level enemies in those games, just really weren't. And then, of course, there's bosses, and they can be really easy or they can be really difficult. But one of the interesting things is that, you can really just fly past these enemies when you're on your horse or even just on foot. That is, I'll get to a little bit later, but that's kind of where the core of my issues with the game lie. So anyway, the other two parts of the game are the legacy dungeons, which is where that classic From Software, almost Metroidvania-ish dungeon level design comes from. Stuff that they've been doing since the original Kingsfield. There are major and minor legacy dungeons in the game, so the main ones have the main storyline bosses, and the lesser ones might have, it might have cool items or a really helpful Ash of War, which is like a special ability you can add to your movesets, to your weapon movesets. So those might be in the minor dungeons, and those are still, they're still totally worthwhile, but they're usually a bit easier. Then from there, there's optional dungeons, which are, there's small caves and crypts and other side locations. For the most part, again, if you're right within the correct level range, they're pretty easy in terms of what the game is asking for you, because they're normally fairly short, probably taken out in 5 to 10 minutes. There's nothing groundbreaking in the optional dungeons, I will say. In some of the legacy dungeons, there's some really neat ideas. Nothing too outside of what From Software has done, but just implemented in interesting ways, for sure. But that's just not in the optional dungeons. But that's okay, because I still think that the optional dungeons are a lot of fun. And every time I find one, I get really excited. I think some people might equate them to the shrines in Breath of the Wild, but I find these to be more interesting from a visual perspective, insofar as like sometimes it's a mausoleum or it's a crypt. Other times it's a mine or ruins on a cliffside. Like there's a lot of visual and environmental variety even within this really small optional stuff. That said, there's just not a lot of puzzle solving. There might be traps and stuff, but once you know the visual language and the layout of these dungeons, there's not a lot to do other than fighting things, which again, you can kind of see where some of my tensions with this game are starting to come in. And really what the problem is that I'm just very picky about open world games in general. I need them to be more than just a vector for delivering content, right? So for the most part, I tend to not like Ubisoft type of open world games. I'm one of those people who just kind of bounces off the Horizon games. The thing is, with Elden Ring, it's not a checklist game. It's not an Ubisoft game. But despite its beauty, it just hasn't justified its open world to me yet, even almost 20 plus hours in. And I think a lot of the issue just has to do with how you move through and engage with the open world. Part of the issue is Torrent, the horse goat thing that you ride on. It's nice to have to get around the environment faster, and you can double jump, but there's no mechanical difference or mechanical engagement with Torrent. Like, it's just you moving faster. Like, he moves exactly the same as you. Whereas in games like, even in GTA, the cars move different than the player. And in Breath of the Wild, the horse moves different than the player. In The Witcher 3, Roach moves different than Geralt. Do you get what I mean? Like, in Elden Ring, I don't really feel that. Outside, the double jump and the speed, but there's nothing there that you have to be mindful of in contrast to when you're on foot. And he also, he makes just rocketing past a difficult encounter completely possible, which is fine. I need to underscore that it's totally fine that the stuff in the open world isn't challenging. I'm not saying this game needs to be way harder. It's just, I don't feel like I'm engaging with it really. I really think that the over-reliance on combat is part of the issue. Like, it's the only way to interact with the world. And I'm not saying that they needed to add climbing mechanics. I'm not saying that they needed to have more story or that they needed to have puzzle solving or any of this stuff. Some of that could have worked. Obviously, it would have been fine. And of course, I don't mean they needed to add checklists. I actively dislike that style of open world, and I'm so glad that Elden Ring is closer to Breath of the Wild, or even really Shadow of the Colossus in its open world design. What I mean is, this open world has a lot to see and a lot to do, but the time between those moments are just mechanically dull. Like, let's look at some counterexamples. Plenty of easier, non-combat focused open world games, they keep the player constantly engaged. Like Legends Arceus, for example, Pokemon Legends Arceus. It's a woefully bland open world, but you're constantly engaging with that moment-to-moment gameplay. Catching Pokemon, that's the whole point of the game, is catching Pokemon, but you need Pokeballs to do that. And in order to have Pokeballs, you have to craft them. And in order to craft, you have to be constantly like breaking the rocks and picking up stuff from trees and battling. That also requires resources. which you get from collecting materials or crafting items. In Elden Ring, there is crafting, but you only need to craft things every once in a while. You don't need to engage in most of that crafting in the open world. It's really just like, collect stuff out in the open world, and then maybe I'll use it in a dungeon when I'm, up against an enemy that does poison, or I'm in a swamp that does poison, or there's bleed damage, or something like that, Otherwise, like, you don't need any of the resources to be in the open world. And that's what I mean. Like, there's nothing in the open world that's justifying itself. Like, another example, Breath of the Wild. It has a bunch of limited use items. There's weapon durability, which I know is contentious. There's cooldown timers for your abilities. There's a stamina meter. There's environmental factors that you have to contend with, like rain and lightning and other weather factors. All of those forces require you to stay engaged with the world at all times. Exploring for new weapons to replace the broken ones. You have to keep an eye out for enemies. You have to use the environment and your own abilities to overcome foes and solve puzzles. And then you need to collect things to cook them, to turn into meals, to buff your resistances or heal you in combat. And again, outside of just a little bit of flower picking, that stuff doesn't really exist when you're out in the open world in Elden Ring. And that's such a huge contrast to how engaged you have to be in these dungeons, where every corner is an enemy that could completely slaughter you. There's traps. You're constantly looking for new routes, new secrets, and all that sort of thing. Like Shadow of Colossus, another good example. You have to constantly be figuring out how to get to the next location using Wander and Agro's limited traversal tools, and they both move really difficult. In Elden Ring, you move pretty well. Your character moves well, and that's cool, especially in combat. But in the open world, where you're doing less combat and you're mostly just wandering around, I don't know, there's just a lack of intentionality that's really odd for a From Software game. I'm not looking for it to be like Death Stranding necessarily, where, literally every step, you have to engage with every step that Sam takes. And there's this layer of numerous systems that are constantly working against your progress. You have to monitor, the terrain. You have to check on Sam's health and stamina, the BB's mood, all of those things to find the smoothest way forward. I don't need that level of engagement with the open world, but even something more akin to like how Red Dead Redemption 2 does it, which has players engaging with systems that heighten the immersion and your sense of place. Managing your horse, your inventory. There's other character systems that all directly affect how you interact with the world. And that's something that I feel like would be expected of an open world, and expected especially from a From Software open world that's just not there. The fact that I'm talking positively about Red Dead Redemption 2 as a comparison to Elden Ring is surprising, because I mostly don't like Red Dead Redemption 2. And I think that Elden Ring is like maybe one of the greatest games ever made. But anyway, the point is just that Elden Ring doesn't do anything when I'm in the open world to make me feel engaged with it beyond just looking really nice and having a few hidden items to explore and whatnot. That just disappoints me, because this is from a development studio that has this long legacy of designing and perfecting intentional game mechanics, whether that's in the combat, whether that's in the crafting, just in how you move and walk through these environments. And make no mistake, I am happy to roam around these lands, taking in the immense scenery and basking in FromSoft's aesthetic genius between these long gauntlets that require intense focus. And I guess you could argue that that's maybe why there's so little of that FromSoft tension and intentionality in the exploration. But I think this game would be better for it. And again, it doesn't need to be difficult. It doesn't need to be challenging. It doesn't need to be masochistic. There's just very little systemic engagement there. And so I just find myself wishing that From Software had somehow brought some of that intentionality that is so present in these dungeons. Because let me tell you, the Legacy dungeons might be some of the best level design that From Software has ever had, period. It's not as interconnected and shortcut heavy. I mean, there's plenty of shortcuts, but it's not as shortcut heavy as something like the original Dark Souls, and it can't be, right? Because it's not this one contiguous Metroidvania map. I kind of wish that was in the open world, that figuring out your way through this required a bit more interaction with the environment, whether that's like solving puzzles or engaging with character mechanics or engaging with the crafting in a way that allowed you to really spend more time with the open world and with the locations beyond just fighting what's there or jumping up with torrent, like double jumping across a few gaps and whatnot. Or, you know, the other option is to have simply cut out the open world entirely and just bolster the dungeons and those other authored sections with the flexibility and variety that fills the open world. You know, those lulls in tension that let you relax in between these heavy combat encounters. Because I totally understand why the open world is there. It's to give people something to do in between these super difficult boss fights. If you're crit pathing this game, you're going to run into bosses that are so much stronger than you so quickly. Like, you have to go be in the open world. But other than the heavy gating in the dungeons and fighting things out in the open world, there's almost no reason for it to exist. They could have been smaller locations that offer just the same amount of flexibility and relief between the big bosses and just the more tightly wound dungeons without being this massive thing. And it still could have looked amazing. It still could have had the same skyboxes and vistas in the distance and all this stuff. It just would have been, I think, a bit more restrained and a bit more authored and a bit more intentional. And those are things, those were the exact words that I would describe everything about From Software and their previous work. And almost everything in Elden Ring, except for when it comes to the open world. It feels like there are two different games. There's the open world game, and then there's the dungeons. The game just really feels like a Dark Souls game, broken up and spread across an open world, so far for no real reason. To From Software's credit, this is their first truly open world, and it is impressive. Like, the fact that it's so densely packed with unique things to see and just such interesting world and level design compared to something like any of the other Ubisoft games that I've mentioned in this video, it's incredible. And this is the first time they've done it. And look, my criticisms are sharp, but they are not fatal. I need to emphasize that this is, in many ways, Elden Ring is From Software's best game yet. And it is by far my favorite game of this year and probably will be by the time the year is over. And it's maybe the best game that I've played in years. My disappointment is more that I see just so much potential left on the table and wishing it had more From Software design philosophy in its open world systems. It's an incredible achievement, absolutely. I love the game, and I just can't wait to spend dozens and dozens of more hours with it, but I guess I just expected a little more. I don't know, I think it's important to bring up these issues. I'm not saying my opinions here are correct. Again, I've only been playing for 20 hours. My feelings might change on this completely. And I'm not saying that anyone who disagrees is wrong or that anyone who loves the way this game is structured or that their opinions are invalid. I'm not saying that at all. But the point of stuff like reviews and criticism, even when they're early, even early impressions like this, is meant to express our experiences and our opinions so that creators of the game or whatever it is that we are reviewing or talking about can take those notes, see if it lines up what they wanted to achieve, and then apply any necessary lessons and feedback to their next games. Because reality is, From Software has set the bar so high with Elden Ring. Expectations for whatever their next game is going to be will be astronomical. So that's why I'm pointing out the flaws in the design from my perspective. So anyway, that's where I am with Elden Ring. Like I said, this is not a full review at all. I just thought it would be interesting and worthwhile to get these early thoughts out there and see if they change once I put the game down in like 40, 50, or 100 hours from now, or however long it is. And, I also just kind of wanted to open up discussion with anyone who's out there watching. Let me know how you feel about Elden Ring down in the comments below. Let's chat about what you love, what you wish was different, what you wish was more like older games, or what you wish they had abandoned compared to older games. Like, I know there's people out there who wish there were even fewer dungeons and it was just more of an open world. And I'm curious to hear opinions from anyone. Just remember that the point of these discussions isn't to debate or to argue with folks. Differences of opinion are valid, they're natural, they're healthy, and I encourage everyone to be friendly and engage with each other and with me in positive and healthy ways if this does happen to spark some discussion in the comments. And, of course, please like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It really does help this channel. It helps me see what people are interested in. And, let me know if you'd be interested in more impressions videos like this in the future. I know it's a little bit messier compared to the super scripted stuff that I did, but I had a lot of fun doing it, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it too. So yeah, anyway, thanks so much for watching, friends. I'll catch you in the next video.